Hi there, my name's Ashley Franson. Welcome to my presentation. Today I'm going to be speaking about the recognition of traditional Indigenous place names. So first, I would just like to start by introducing my topic a little bit and explaining about what I'm going to be talking about in my presentation, just so you have an understanding of what to expect. So first, I'd like to start off by saying that my presentation is going to be focusing primarily on the history of traditional Indigenous place names, so where these names came from, what they mean, what they represent, and what their significance is. I'm also going to be speaking about the impact of colonialism and how traditional Indigenous place names started to be replaced with Western-inspired, European-inspired place names, which is where these issues actually started to arise from. So I'm going to be speaking about that. I'm also going to be speaking specifically about the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as those nations are what specifically relate to the article that I have chosen, which relates to the Vancouver Park Board. So my article that I've chosen is specifically set in Vancouver, so I will be speaking about these Vancouver Indigenous nations and Vancouver as a whole. So I'm also going to be speaking about the significance relating to this matter of certain legal documents such as the Indian Act, the Royal Proclamation 1763, and the Constitution Act 1867, and specifically Section 35 of the Constitution Act. And finally, I'm going to be speaking about reconciliation regarding this issue and how not only British Columbia and the Vancouver Park Board are going about resolving this issue, but also how the Canadian federal government is going about reconciling and how they're going about honoring these nations and these traditional Indigenous place names. So first off here, I'm going to be speaking about the history of traditional Indigenous place names. So this is extremely important to recognize the significance and the importance of Indigenous place names, as each individual Indigenous nation and Indigenous community has specific place names related to them that are important to them, that have come and been passed down from different teachings within that community. So it's very important to recognize the uniqueness and the significance of each individual place name, not just place names as a whole, but like I said, the importance and the significance of the individual Indigenous place names. Indigenous place names are meant to represent and honor Indigenous nations. That kind of goes without saying, as a lot of place names we have are meant to represent things. Indigenous place names are very, very important to specific Indigenous nations, and they represent them and honor them. And as the slide says there, in Canada, we have approximately 30,000 official place names that are of Indigenous origin. So this is very, very important and very relevant to Canadian history, the Indigenous place names that can be seen and can be found throughout the country. So when these place names are stripped and replaced with Western European names, it's extremely offensive and intrusive to the original Indigenous nations' place names and to the Indigenous nations that originally made up that land, and the place names that they set on those lands to represent specific things. And as it says on the slide there, these names are chosen for very specific reasons, such as geographical areas that carry rich Indigenous history, traditional environmental knowledge, navigational information, and teachings. A lot of place names have actually been passed down from teachings through different Indigenous nations throughout time, throughout hundreds of thousands of years. So these are very important, and as I said, carry a lot of rich history with them. So I'm going to be speaking specifically about the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as I said. And these three nations here are three of the various tribes, nations that make up the Coast Salish peoples. And the Coast Salish peoples are actually who are Indigenous to the Pacific Northwest coast. So they are who originally made up the Pacific Northwest coast. As you can see on the map there, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations make up the area around Vancouver, all the way up past Whistler and up towards Squamish, British Columbia. And the Squamish were actually the first Indigenous peoples of British Columbia to make contact with European explorers, as you can see on the slide there. So they've been occupying that land for a very, very long time, and were the first Indigenous group of BC, as I said, to make this contact. And the Musqueam people are the oldest residents of Vancouver, and the Great Maripole Midden, which is located in modern-day Maripole, Vancouver, British Columbia, was once an ancient Musqueam village and burial site, which does make the Musqueam people the oldest residents. This dates back over 4,000 years. And I'd just like to touch on something called the Fraser Gold Rush. So the Fraser Gold Rush began in 1857 after gold was discovered on the Thompson River, which is just near Kamloops, British Columbia. This attracted many foreign settlers into the area, which has contributed greatly to the continued displacement of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So along with the Fraser Gold Rush, that's just one very prominent example. A lot of other things have also contributed to the displacement of these nations and to the displacement of these nations' place names, specifically within Stanley Park and around various different city parks and beaches in Vancouver. So the article that I am focusing this presentation around is titled Vancouver Park Board Passes Motion to Recognize Indigenous Place Names, and is a CBC News article posted on September 18th of this year. So just like to outline that is the specific article that I'm going to be talking about today. So the Vancouver Park Board passed a motion recognizing traditional Indigenous place names for the city's parks and beaches. So for the parks and beaches that are in Vancouver. And this motion was voted on by commissioners, and it notes that the lands under the jurisdiction of the Park Board are unceded by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So with the board having previously approved several reconciliation strategies, including Aboriginal language rights, it has decided to also recognize the traditional names of places in Vancouver as they're known to Indigenous peoples, so specifically the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The Park Board says that it's going to work with these three nations to identify the traditional names of places within the board's jurisdiction. And the motion states that those names will be recognized by the Park Board and acknowledged in ways deemed appropriate by the relevant First Nations. So by the relevant First Nations, meaning the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The impact of colonialism. So colonialism, in this sense here, ultimately led to a denial of the power of Aboriginal peoples and, in time, to the denial of their right to govern themselves. As the slide states here, through the Indian Act, the federal government took authority over traditional governance structures and asserted control of life on reserves. Now, this changed in the 1980s and 90s when the federal government recognized the inherent right of the self-government of Aboriginal peoples. And Vancouver Park Board Commissioner and Chair Stuart McKinnon, who actually put forth the motion to recognize traditional Indigenous place names, stated that, quote, part of the colonization of Vancouver was the changing of traditional names, end quote. He goes on to state that, quote, my motion is part of reconciliation in Vancouver to recognize that these Indigenous people have been here forever and that they have had place long before we were here, end quote. So as mentioned on the last slide, the Indian Act 1876, this was first passed by the Canadian government in 1876. And it's a Canadian federal law that governs in matters pertaining to, quote, Indian status, bonds, and Indian reserves, end quote. It called for the designation of specific plots of land to be, quote, Indian reserves, end quote. Throughout history, it's been highly invasive as it authorizes the Canadian federal government to regulate and administer in the affairs and day-to-day lives of registered Indigenous peoples and reserve communities. So it's since been amended, but it's still a crucial part of understanding Canadian Indigenous history, and it was the primary legal document governing the interaction between the Canadian government and the Squamish Nation. So the Indian Act plays a really, really large role in understanding the history of Indigenous culture in Canada. And next we have the Royal Proclamation, and the Royal Proclamation is a document that set out guidelines for European settlement of Aboriginal territories in what is now North America. So it was issued by King George III on October 7th of 1763, following Great Britain's acquisition of French territory in North America after the end of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. So the document explicitly states that Aboriginal title does exist and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty, and that only the Crown can buy land from First Nations. So, for example, if you or me were to try to buy land from Aboriginal peoples, this document specifically and explicitly stated that no, only the Crown can buy this land. The proclamation is and was an important first step towards the recognition of existing Aboriginal rights and title, including the right to self-determination, which is simply the process by which a person controls their own life. So the Royal Proclamation is a really, really important first step, especially looking back at Indigenous history that relates to land titles, self-titles, and moving forward towards reconciliation. And finally, we have the Constitution Act. So the Constitution Act 1867 is a major part of Canada's Constitution. The Act defines much of the operation of the Government of Canada, including its federal structure, the House of Commons, the Senate, the justice system, and the taxation system. So since its inception in 1867, it has been interpreted to include not only First Nations, but also Métis and Inuit peoples as well. And I'm going to be speaking specifically and on the next slide about Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal rights, which brings us now to our next slide. So, Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. In this Act, Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. For greater certainty, in subsection 1, treaty rights includes rights that now exist by way of land claim agreements or may be so acquired. Notwithstanding any other provision of this Act, the Aboriginal and treaty rights referred to in subsection 1 are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. So Section 35 is extremely important, especially in terms of relating to this issue and to my argument, because it pertains exclusively to Aboriginal rights and includes land rights, which is a really important legal point that supports the motion to recognize traditional Indigenous place names. So Section 35 of the Constitution Act, I really wanted to point out, as I said, because it relates specifically to this issue and relates specifically to land rights and Aboriginal land rights, which in turn relates to the land rights of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver. So to end my presentation, I would just like to speak about reconciliation and about the reconciliation specifically relating to Indigenous place names and to honoring traditional Indigenous place names where names have been stripped and replaced with Western and European-inspired names. So again, as Vancouver Park Board Commissioner and Chair Stuart McKinnon states, that the Park Board is going to work with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations to identify and honor their traditional place names. I believe this is a good step towards reconciliation between the Canadian federal government and the specific Indigenous nations regarding traditional land titles. Traditional Indigenous place names of city parks and beaches are starting to be recognized and reinstated or developed to honor specific Indigenous nations to which these lands traditionally belong to. So it's really important to recognize that this motion set by the Vancouver Park Board it doesn't erase the discrimination that the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people have faced, but it's definitely a good first step, and I believe it's a good step in the right direction. And if this goes through, and if traditional Indigenous place names start to be honored for their original place names in British Columbia, I think that all of Canada as a whole should start to adopt these methods, and not just the Park Board itself, but also the federal government should put this into place and should absolutely honor the traditional place names of Indigenous nations and Indigenous communities on traditional land that was once named after these specific nations. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned a bit about traditional Indigenous place names, and definitely about land rights relating to Indigenous peoples. And yeah, thank you so much.